I will present to you some of my ideas and work on sexual violence as a strategy of political demobilization. And it's a work in progress, and it ties in a bit with Sinisha's presentation that you all just witnessed. So there are some similar ideas, and actually Sinisha's presentation has given me some inspiration on how to think further of how to see sexual violence as a strategy. And so my questions here were mainly on, we often say sexual violence has a very big impact on communities. As Zilka just said, it destroys the fabric of societies. But my question was, how does that actually work? And what is the interest of the perpetrators to use that kind of violence, and what is the goal that they want to reach with that type of violence? So that was my starting point to think about sexual violence. So what does it do precisely to communities to destroy them, and what is so interesting about precisely using that strategy to inflict harm on people? Why not just kill them or harm them in other ways? Why sexual violence? So it's about the political meaning of sexual violence. I have to watch my PPT a bit to follow the right directions. So the questions are about perpetrators and their goals of using sexual violence, and also about the links between individual trauma and collective trauma, and as well as individual healing and a kind of collective healing of sexual trauma. So the overview of the presentation, I will first say something on the dominant paradigm of thinking about sexual violence. That's the feminist paradigm. Then I will discuss a bit state perpetration of sexual violence and how you can, how you see that in very different cases. The effects of sexual violence on individuals and communities and trauma. Then political communities and trauma, and how trauma affects political communities, or how political communities are formed by trauma, and what is so special about sexual trauma and collective political communities. And then the conclusions. So the feminist paradigm initially was very much focused on female victims of sexual violence, but has now also incorporated male victims. And it also has a political element. So the explanation for sexual violence also has a political element to it. Namely, if you look at the perpetration of sexual violence as at a structural level, you can see that, and this is a quote from Sarah Meager from her book, Rape, Loot and Pillage. When considered systematically, this form of violence represents an institutional and structural power that serves to reconstruct hierarchical gender, political, social, economic, and cultural relations. So it's about restructuring gender relations and reinforcing certain gender hierarchies. So women are at the bottom of the gender hierarchy, and hegemonic masculinity is at the top. And I will show you a pyramid of gender relations in a minute, that you can see how that actually works. So sexual violence is a form of structural violence, reinforcing and restructuring the gender hierarchy. And that explains both sexual violence against women and against men. So this is the graph of in Sarah Meager's book. So you see at the top hegemonic masculinity. The allied masculinities are the masculinities that support the hegemonic masculinity. Marginalized masculinities. Subordinate masculinities, for example, homosexuality would be a subordinated masculinity, which is under there. And then the lowest of the low would be the femininities. So sexual violence serves to reinforce this kind of gender hierarchy. But then I thought, okay, this is very interesting, but it doesn't go very deep on precisely the political implications of sexual violence. So I started to think of, out of the perspective of state perpetrators. So what does a state, or what do state actors have to gain from political violence? And with state actors, I mean paramilitary actors, military, the police, military police, but there's also, for example, mobs that are used by the state. That's, for example, in Egypt. In Egypt at Tahrir Square, you probably all remember that, the Spring Revolution. They used mobs that would sexually attack people, both men and women, usually more women than men, but there were also male victims. So these were employed by the state in order to diffuse the blame that you could attribute to sexual violence to the state. Then, very interestingly, they would say, you know, all these people in these mobs are like the depraved people who sexually attack, and we should reinstore morals now. We need more morals. So that would sort of restate the gender hierarchy by using that type of violence and using a mob so you could deflect blame to the mob or to certain elements, which is often the term that they would use. So it's very interesting if you look from the perspective of state perpetrator that you can see patterns across time and across regimes. So in Egypt, you would see that this happens at Tahrir Square, but it's actually something that happens throughout the recent political history of Egyptian regimes. So sexual violence was also used before Tahrir, and it's also used now after Tahrir, also in detention centers against both women and men. So it's and my argument for that is that there exists a kind of infrastructure of such violence. It's something that is used by these militaries, by these military police, and that becomes a kind of pattern that keeps on going, irrespective of who is the leader. And very interestingly also, the case of Chicago, there was a Chicago policeman who used sexual torture against mostly black men, but probably also women. And this sexual torture, he used kind of electric devices for that. And those devices were also used in the Vietnam War. And this military policeman was in the Vietnam War. So he used the tools that were used there. The same goes, I think, for the Lori prison in Split. I think some of you might be aware of that case from the war. Where also kind of devices were used, electric devices for genital torture, which I have seen and found some documentation on these being used in other cases, for example, in Kosovo before the war, or in other prisons in the former Yugoslavia. So you see that there is a kind of infrastructure, there is a kind of tools that are being used irrespective of who is in the regime. So that is the advantage of looking from the perspective of the state perpetrator. Then you can also see certain patterns across geographic space or across certain empires. You see lots of sexual violence by colonial empires, by the Belgians in the Congo, by the British in Kenya. 3 more minutes. I have to be really, really quick then. I'm talking too much. So you see it, Tahrir, Iran, Zimbabwe, election violence in Kenya. So all kinds of periods of contentious politics. So it's actually a form of state terrorism. This is the definition of state terrorism. I won't read it because I have only 3 minutes. So what exactly are the goals of that kind of violence? And I think that it's about political demobilization. So the definition of political demobilization is it makes it impossible for people with very little individual power to collectively resist or challenge established and organized groups that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, or the process through which subordinate groups lose their capacity to pursue collective goals. And the link there is with how effective communities are formed after trauma. That was what Sinisha was talking about. So the link between individual trauma and collective trauma hinges on emotions and on the use of emotions in politics. So emotions are not just personal expressions of ourselves, but they also play a very big social and political role, and they create connections between people. They create effective communities, and these effective communities are often created in response to a certain trauma. This is Emma Hutchinson's work that I just mentioned now. She analyzes 3 cases, and one of them is, for example, the Bali bombings. I think this was 2002, Australia, where she shows how newspapers interpret certain individual narratives of trauma, and how these are used to sort of for a kind of emotional nationalism is what she calls it. But of course there are 2 ways that you can use these traumas. You can also use it for a more healing, regenerative perspective. So practices of commemoration and remembrance frame or narrate trauma in a way that helps to dissolve feelings of contingency and isolation. And it's often used to prop up the nation state. So social memory is the key, and that's where it becomes interesting when you analyze sexual violence. So this is the political choice. You can either work it through in a way that generates transformative ties, or you can work through it in a more emotionally nationalist way. But then if we apply it to the trauma of sexual violence, the question is, 1 minute, I will go over time, yeah. But it's just like 2 or 3 slides. So sexual violence by state actors strategically employs gendered taboos and kind of collective sexual scripts that we hold, kind of rape myths of how sexuality and gender work. So if you look at how sexual torture and sexual violence is applied in these contexts, you see that it's often talks about or refers to certain taboos that we hold on homosexuality, bestiality, on sex before marriage, virginity, pedophilia, young and old. So you would see that people are forced to have sex with each other, people who are each other's family, for example, young old people with old people. So it's often refers to a kind of taboo. And this has an extra effect on an individual, of course, because a person is implicated in his own torture. So because it's linked to the social taboo, the shame and the humiliation are even bigger, and it becomes even more difficult to talk about such a trauma because you cannot connect it to a kind of public narrative. So the silence is actually coded in the act of sexual violence and sexual torture. So that's interesting, but when you then look at social memory, of course it becomes very difficult to use these like individual narratives because they connect only to a kind of stigma. So it's difficult to form a kind of regenerative narrative of that.
I'm sorry, I have to ask you to stop now because we have 2 more presenters that have to finish by 10. So let's leave at least 10 minutes for discussion in the end. So I hope you will be able to...
By 11.
Yeah, by 11, sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll just see if there is any... They can connect. So I sort of summarized it, I think. So silence go to the end. And then Fearke says there are 2 kinds of traumas. There is the trauma of grief and there's a sexual trauma. And with grief, it's much easier to form a kind of collective community around that and to connect people. But with sexual violence, that's not possible. And that is why I think sexual violence is such an important topic to tackle. For example, also when it comes to intervention. And I can finish there.